Hello, welcome back to FM Live. My name is Mike, and today we're going to be talking about adjustable brake proportion valves. So you've probably heard of these and maybe even seen these, but oftentimes we get a lot of questions about them. So I think that we need to dispel a few questions and myths about what a proportion valve does and why you might want an adjustable one to be able to improve upon the factory one. So what we're going to be talking about today, and just to give you some eye candy, is this little doodad. This one is from WilWood. We are a WilWood dealer, so we do prefer their proportioning valve, although they do come in several different flavors from all kinds of different brands. They all do mostly the same thing, and they look pretty close to the same in most applications. Now, for Miatas, they have a pretty, relatively simple and straightforward braking system. So this will be pretty easy to exemplify, and I'll show you some cool, examples in just a little bit. But this little valve on a Miata anyway, the way we use it, has one in on this side, they're covered with stickers, and an out. And then here at the top, we have an adjustable screw. And what it does is it restricts flow. Now, before we get into anything too terribly deep here, I'll stop for just a moment and ask that if you have questions about this, if I don't cover something, or if I say something that makes you think of another question, feel free to drop us a comment down below. As we're doing the video, I will try to stop and answer any applicable questions to what we're talking about here. If I don't happen to get to yours, my apology. We will try to get it taken care of after the video has been posted up on Facebook, YouTube, etc., etc. So to continue on with this little guy, as I mentioned, in and out and a restriction, which is simply done by twisting clockwise or counterclockwise to change the restriction of flow that is being passed through from one side to the other. Now, that's pretty straightforward in theory. And really, the adjustable one, it works the same way as a factory one. Here is one, for example, that is a factory Mazda proportion valve off of a Miata. And this one has more ins and outs, but basically this side right here, does it have F's on the front? It does, yeah. So you can see, here I'll hold it this way, this top portion here has F for front, and it's just an in and an out. You can actually see all the way down through it because there's no restriction on the front. Now this one, the way it has kind of offset ins and outs, in on this side, out on this side, this is for the rear. And this is where it has some basically built-in restriction that's not adjustable. See, it doesn't have any way to adjust it on the end like this one does. And it has a restriction built in, so that way the rear brakes don't get as much of the brake flow or the hydraulic flow and pressure. So why is that? Why would you want to restrict flow to the rear is probably the first important question to answer. So on any kind of a automotive application, or 99.9% of the automotive applications, including Miatas, you want to have more pressure for your brake system up front than you do on the rear. And this is for a number of reasons, but primarily because your front brakes do the majority of the work. You have things such as weight transfer and caliper piston sizes, or area for that surface that is being pressed against by your fluid to actually push your pads against the rotors to make them stop the car. And you want to have a greater pressure and therefore greater effort being applied to the front of the car than you do the rear. That's how most all modern cars are set up. It's very natural. And that's why in Miatas, you'll see these on pretty much every Miata, except for some of the cars that came with ABS later on. Some of the factory NB2s and NCs, NDs, they all have a different system, and we'll talk about that a little bit in the future here. But basically, this is going to be something that you can look under the hood of your Miata, and you'll probably see something like this. And if you do, that means you can replace it with one of these guys in most cases. So now, we talked about the rear. Why doesn't the front get restriction? Well, basically the front, as I mentioned, it gets the majority of the effort to stop the car, So we don't want to have any kind of restriction there. We just want to control one of the two lanes, front versus rear, rather than restrict some of the flow for one and restrict it at a greater extent to the other one. There might be some cars out there that actually do have instances like that, but for Miatas, again, we're fortunate that they're relatively straightforward, simple setups. So full flow or full pressure on the fronts and restricted pressure on the rears. Now, why would you want to change it is probably the next important question. And the reason being is that with these ones, obviously, they're not adjustable. So you just simply can't, even if you wanted to with these, unless you changed it for something else. But in most applications from the factory, these guys, the factory ones are actually set up to be relatively front bias heavy. So meaning that the front brakes do the vast majority of the work. Now, how much of that is a difference? It depends on your particular year of Miata, but essentially you're giving up or not allowing your rear brakes to do as much of the work as they possibly could, which if you were able to let them do more work, you would shorten your stopping distances. So on the street, we're not talking about something that you probably are going to have or see a lot of effectiveness on a street car, except for maybe panic stopping, possibly. For most cars, it's not going to make a difference that you're going to tell huge amounts, but the reason why most people want one of these is either because they're racing their Miata, and so they want to make their brakes work as best they can for them, so that way they can be effectively stopping the car to get it around the track as quickly as possible, or if you change your brake calipers. So all of your brake system from the master cylinder in the car, basically you press the pedal and it pushes a piston, and that piston then pushes fluid down to your brake calipers. But that piston that's attached to your brake pedal is the master cylinder. And it's basically, think of it as what creates all the pressure to send it to your brakes. And the ratio of the size or the area, the surface area of that piston moving fluid also is a relationship to the pistons in your calipers. So you only have so much X amount of fluid to be able to push against your pistons that are this size. And that ratio is important because you can affect your brake bias and how effective your brakes are using that ratio. So if you change your brake calipers, say I've got a stock 1994 Miata and stock brake calipers. Well, obviously Mazda has done quite a bit of development to make sure that this is okay, it's good. It's not meant for a racing application, but it does great for what you need on the street. Now, if you change your calipers to something else, you obviously want to get your WilWood, StockTex, whatever else brake caliper set up to where that their piston sizing, that overall area, surface area, is as close as you can to the factory piston surface area, but you're never really, almost ever going to be exact. So to be able to better dial in that ratio, you can't use this, you need to use an adjustable one, so that way you can help to even your brake bias out again. Now you can change the master cylinder as well, but that changes everything for the whole system. So if you're changing to really different size pistons in your calipers because you're going with a completely different kind of kit, you may need to do more than just an adjustable brake bushing valve, but we'll save that for a different video. Actually, you know what? Keith has a great video on the effects of brake bias and weight transfer and some more brake theory that we will link down in the description below after this video is done. So if you'd like to really get into some more of the nerdy aspects of that, we will have a great video lined up for you. So, sorry, started thinking the really nerdy stuff. We need to get back on track a little bit here. So if you change the calipers to something different, you may want to adjust or fine-tune your bias, your front to rear bias. When I talk about bias, I'm talking about how much pressure is sent to the front versus the rear as a ratio. So if you're changing or basically wanting to dial in your bias, no matter what you have, this is a good idea. Or if you're changing calipers, even if they're pretty well-matched calipers, this is also a good idea. And that's why if you're looking at any of our big brake kits, you'll see that we recommend this for most NAs and NBs. Again, some of the instances with ABS in the later cars you don't have to worry about. Okay, so how do you use it is the next question we usually get about these guys. So when you do an installation with one of these, obviously this is just the rear. For the front, to get rid of this guy, you take this out, you put this in for the rears, and then we simply have a union that goes in place of the fronts. So again, full pressure, not any restriction, but this simply replaces this guy as a unit. If I can hold all three pieces in my hands. That's what you're doing. You're replacing this one part with these two parts. That's simply all it is as far as on the car. So actually, let's look over here at the car that we have parked next to us here. You can see one in situ. And this guy, you can see the two different lines here. Coming out of our master cylinder, you've got two lines, two feed lines. So this one here off to the side, they're kind of convoluted, so my apologies that this isn't a little bit clear. But this one is your feed line for the front brakes. So you can see possibly down here that there's a union. This is that union for the front line. So 100% full pressure on the fronts. And then this line for the rears comes down and around in a convoluted manner, comes in through the bottom and out through the top. So this is our adjustable brake proportion valve for the rear brakes. So that way we can set the bias by restricting the rear brake flow and pressure. So in place, it's not very complicated. Of course, you do have to break your brake lines open and you'll make a little bit of a mess. So make sure you've got your rags and brake clean spray out to be able to clean up after yourself once you make a mess. But otherwise, installing it's pretty straightforward and easy. How to use it once it is installed is that you'll go drive the car and essentially you get to go out, find a nice quiet area of road or perhaps a big empty parking lot, and you basically go out and do stoppies for a while and have a bunch of fun and see if you can pull your face off. But you'll want to use this basically by turning the knob to set your bias, and there on the top, hopefully, I don't know if you can see that, there's an arrow here that says less brake pointing counterclockwise. And then if you want more brake or more flow, then you will spin it clockwise. So typically speaking, whenever you are doing this for the first time, you want to spin it all the way towards less brake. And then you'll go out, or pretty close to all the way towards less brake, maybe a couple turns. But then you'll go out, do your testing, and start pressing your brakes, getting your brakes nice and hot, but doing some pretty high force application on your brake pedal. And you'll stop and you'll turn it out a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. But you'll want to do that up until the point where your rear brakes actually lock up before your front brakes do. And you'll know that you've crossed the threshold, and then you want to back it off a little bit. Because what we're aiming for with this guy, since it's a little bit of a test and tune kind of scenario, is that your front brakes lock up just before your rear brakes do. And at that point, you will be at a pretty good level of where your car is going to be about as efficient as you can braking-wise by using a manual adjustment for your rear to front brake bias, that your rears are working pretty good and that they're not overworking and not basically working harder or working with more pressure than the fronts. Because if you go out and actually use the car with your rears with more pressure or more working effectiveness, basically if they lock up first, then the tail end of your car is going to start to wag and you may have a off-road excursion. So this is why you want to go do it out somewhere that you have a good spot to be able to be away from people, away from things when you're doing this testing. So one of the questions about these, comparing stock to the aftermarket piece that we have from WilWood, is what's the difference? You know, there are different proportion valves, but why would I want an adjustable one rather than just swapping one of these guys out? And the reason being, one, obviously this is relatively, you know, it's got a range of adjustment, so it's relatively easy to dial in without changing parts. But your stock proportion valve, depending on what year Miata you have, it may have a reduction in pressure from front to rear as much as about 70% at kind of the very, I guess, bad end of the spectrum where your rear brakes are not doing very much. at all, to up to about 53, 54% of what the fronts are doing. So you've got a pretty wide range that Mazda used, just depending on which one you have. This one, you can go from obviously open. Yeah, if I spin it all the way open, then that would be 100% pressure, so no restriction. And then as you start to introduce more restriction by spinning the knob, you can go down to as much as 43% of maximum flow. So you've got a range of 57% that you can use this proportioning valve to tune into. Are you stretching, or do you have a question for me? No? Okay. We've got guys in the background watching for questions, so. We've talked a lot, and I feel like I may start to have some people whose eyes are glazing over. So let's stop here talking about this stuff, and I'll show you a little bit of a presentation about how this works in practical application, because a lot of people can understand this, but it's easier to wrap your mind around what it's doing by seeing it in action. So we had, I don't want to brag too much, but let's just say somebody of at least 5th grade skill and creativity come up with this board. And what it is that it's a mock brake system. And you'll notice that rear, front, we're only dealing with 2 pistons, but you can assume that this could be duplicated just by adding another syringe and another line for both the rear and the front. So that way we had 4 calipers in total. And then this guy over here is our master cylinder. So it all works the same way. All we're doing is pushing fluid around. And then you can see this line here tees off. So instead of having 2 lines out of the master, I just have one that tees off. This is going to the front, so full pressure here to the front caliper. And then this line that tees off comes down through this valve to the rear. So I'm going to use this valve to demonstrate what it is when we introduce more or less restriction. So at the moment, I have this set up to where it's kind of like a factory braking scenario. So we have basically a very conservative rear ratio going on. So we've got the plunger all the way at the top, and when I depress the plunger, you can see the fluid starting to move to both of them. Let's see how much quicker and how much more volume is getting to the front versus the rear. So this is what it's like in a factory scenario, where this valve essentially is like your factory proportioning valve, where you're getting a lower amount of pressure and flow to your rear brakes than you are to your front, and that's, again, perfectly normal. Now, if you want to use one of these guys in this place, so that way you can get this a little bit more even, because say you're down at the low end of the spectrum with only like 30% of your braking effort being applied to the rear, but this is a track car, or you just swapped your calipers and you want to be able to dial in a bit more to get more brake use out of the rear, then simply I can use this valve like I would with this guy, and I'm just going to open the flow a little bit more. And then we will reset this. And now that I have improved the amount of flow, or basically opened up the orifice inside this valve, now whenever we apply the brakes, you still are going to see that the front has more pressure, but we do have more rear pressure and flow going to those rear calipers, so they're being able to apply more effort to the rear. And this can also go the other way. So say if you had an instance where you were driving on really, really low friction surface, or had really low traction tires or something like that, then you might actually want to back this off even more, so that way you have mostly front and not much rear at all. So with this adjustable setup, see how we have a lot more front bias than we do on the rear. So that's the beauty of having something that's adjustable, is because depending on your situation, especially for track use, you want to set it up for particular tracks or instances. This is a handy tool to be able to tune that bias between the front and rear brake system. So hopefully our little science project here helps you to visualize what's going on without having to think too hard about it on a system that you don't really get to see all of the moving parts quite as easily. But in essence, from the mind of a fifth grader, that's what's going on, to try to sum it up as simply as possible with easy to see tools. So let's go ahead and break into some of the questions here. We did get quite a few that were suggestions to talk about that we prompted our audience earlier today and I think yesterday. So thank you very much for those that did ask questions and participate. We're going to talk about the ones that are pertinent to these parts. If we didn't get yours because it was about something else, again, we'll comment on that later on. But one of the questions is about the mounting solution. So obviously the holes, the mounting holes for this guy versus this guy, they're not in the same location. So it is going to be a different mounting solution. Now, that's okay. We have found that when you're taking this guy off, most often you can use one of these holes and still grab one of the factory mounting positions on the master cylinder bracket that comes off or up against the firewall. We do recommend that you try to have at least one of these mounted up. But if you can't, because of your car being a little bit different than others, or because you've removed a lot of parts, or because race car, it's okay. We would prefer that you did have some kind of a mounting point, so that way the valve itself is not being held up by just the brake lines. And for those eagle-eyed among you, you might have noticed that on this car over here, that we don't actually have it mounted to a bracket at all. And it's not ideal, but if you have a pretty short run of brake line between the master and your valve, it's probably not going to move or vibrate too much. Still recommended to have a bracket. That is always the best option if you can do it, even if you have to build a simple bracket. That is the ideal way to do it. And the next question about location is it okay to have the knob close to my exhaust system? And you know, what kind of measures should I take to prevent it from getting damaged if it is too close? So it is a plastic knob. It's a fairly hard plastic knob and relatively thick, so it can withstand under hood temperatures just fine. But if you've got it, you know, up close to your exhaust, it's probably going to melt that knob. And obviously not ideal. So if you can, if that is the instance that you're up against, try to either pivot or move the valve itself to re-aim it if possible. If it's not possible to do that, then you want to use a heat shield of some kind, you know, whether it just be a piece of stainless steel that you've got or aluminum, or if it's like a heat blanket, something to be able to reflect that heat away from the plastic and prevent this knob from getting damaged, because this is going to get damaged, but also there are some internals in here that have O-rings that seal the internal pieces, so you don't want the whole piece to get hot or too hot because it'll damage that stuff. And even worse, if you're on the track and you get it that hot, you may even boil your brake fluid inside the lines and the unit, which introduces air bubbles, and then you get all kinds of exciting off-track experiences. So I would recommend, yes, if you can, keep it far away from your exhaust components if possible, or use shielding to keep it safe and not get too hot. One of the questions that we got was about the ABS, and this is kind of a good point to break into what applications may need this versus the applications that don't because of ABS. Now, the earliest NAs and even the early NBs do have ABS, but it's a kind of dumb ABS system. It does work and it pulses the brakes, but it doesn't really have brake proportioning built in. So it does do good stuff. You can ask several of us here that if you go take a car out on the track that has ABS versus one that doesn't have ABS, and you're used to driving a car with ABS, you're probably going to do a lot better and brake more effectively with ABS, even on the earlier ABS units. They do work, they are effective, but they don't have the automatic proportioning. So if you have an earlier like NA or NB1 that has one of these proportioning valves and ABS, it's still a good idea to use one of these guys. But if you have a later NB, or if you have an NC with ABS or even ND with ABS, those cars have automatic brake proportioning built in to the ABS module. So it does all of the electronic trickery to be able to change how much flow and pressure is being sent to each caliper, or at least each system, front or rear, just because of the ABS system and the programming that Mazda put into it. So you don't need one of these guys if you have like an MB2 with a sport brake package and ABS, not needed. NCs with ABS, not needed. NDs, because they all have ABS, not needed. They're smart enough that they figure it out, and they'll do a pretty good job, probably better than most of us can do by fine-tuning a knob by ourselves. But the question that we got about this is that will a proportioning valve allow for more rear bias before the ABS kicks in? And again, assuming that we're talking about one of those earlier cars, yes, absolutely. So this will still affect brake flow, even when the ABS is active as well, but this will affect brake flow when the ABS is not being activated. So yes, still a very useful tool for those cars. Now we're going to get a little bit off into the deep end of the pool, just because we did get some questions that have come up in the past that are a good one to address, because weight transfer and brake bias, for those that, if these words mean anything to you, you're probably at least have questions about it or concerns about how it works and how they are related. So if you don't know about weight transfer, and that's a word, a phrase that doesn't mean much to you, then this may be a little bit, but don't worry, we'll be right back. So does weight transfer affect, or is it something that you should be concerned about when dealing with your brake bias? Absolutely, because it does have an effect on how much brake effort you can apply to the front or the rear. Weight transfer does that. It's a leverage kind of thing. So the question in particular is, how do spring rates and dampers affect brake proportioning? And the simple answer is they don't. So when you have weight transfer of a vehicle, you will see the nose of the, well, we'll say this, nose of the vehicle probably dive forward like this and the rear comes up, right? Most everybody that's seen a car on the brakes very aggressively has seen that happen. But weight transfer, when that happens, isn't affected by the shocks and the springs. That kind of nosedive is an effect of weight transfer. It's not a cause. It doesn't change the weight transfer. So I won't dive too much deeper into that, because really that can get down a pretty deep rabbit hole. And again, if you are interested in this kind of stuff, I'd strongly recommend you go watch Keith's video. He has some pretty good content on that that's quite a bit further down the rabbit hole than I will go today. Also, I will stop here and also mention that this book, How to Build a High-Performance Mazda Miata MX-5, if you are, again, interested in more of this kind of theory, I strongly recommend you pick up one of these guys, available on our web store. And this has quite a few different categories in it, and lots of pictures, lots of data. But in particular, hey, look, we have a section about brakes and brake proportioning. So if you'd like to learn from the master suspension, brake, and other, all kinds of other hats guru, Keith Tanner, then we have these books available for sale. They have lots of helpful information, and especially if you're looking to dive down the rabbit hole of making a high-performance Miata and getting into the physics and the science of how this stuff works, go check it out. Another related question about this was, can this proportioning valve be used to compensate for excessive nose diving under hard braking? Yes, it can. But it's also related to what kind of traction that you're getting from, like, is it a high traction surface or a slippery surface? Do you have really sticky tires versus really hard all season tires? All of that is going to be affected, and what's your center of gravity, that kind of stuff. So it is one of the variables that can affect that, and how hard you press the brake pedal, of course, is going to be something that affects it. So yes, the short answer is yes. Go get the book, check it out if you really want to dive into that one too. Another good question, and I don't have one here to show you, is what is the, or how useful is the remote knob for these brake proportion valves? So we don't sell them, and it's partially because it's something that you do have to drill holes in your car for if you want, but again, if this is a race car, it probably is okay. But also because they aren't actually intended for these valves. But WilWood does sell a knob with a cable on it that's meant for a adjustable brake master setup. So like a brake bar. But you can use them on these too. So yes, it'll work. It's not intended to work, so we'll leave it at that. Your results may vary. The short answer is that this is generally something that we install in the engine bay, but if you're looking for an option that you can have this knob somewhere accessible by the driver's seat, you may be interested in that, or you may be interested in doing your own brake lines where you can mount this like on the inside of the transmission tunnel and have the knob pop up through your transmission tunnel where it's accessible, something like that. We're talking about more race car solution for the most part here. So if you need more help or ideas on that, give us a call and we'd be happy to talk to you a little bit more about that. One of the questions is, how do you know what the proportion or what the proportion value or ratio you have, you know, what that value is? What did you set it at when you turned it and set it to whatever it was whenever you were going out to go do stoppies in the parking lot? And the simple answer here is that you're not really going to have a number unless you go take some calculated measurements. So really the effectiveness, if you go out and do our practical application instructions for how to set it up and actually feel what it's doing, you won't know the numbers because there's not a readout or anything like that on here. But the short answer is that you shouldn't need to have those numbers. You should be able to go do the testing and get it set up on the street or in a parking lot. Again, safe space that you can not run into other people or other things, and get that set up properly without seeing a ratio somewhere. You can calculate the ratio, but we won't cover that. If you have more questions about that, let me know. Give us a call. Do you suggest this when upgrading to whatever brake package? So this is useful for almost every situation. I think that if you're looking to improve your brakes, this is a great step in the right direction for anybody. Even if you're not swapping your calipers, your pads, your brake lines, anything, this can be a noticeable improvement with what you have now. So if you're considering a brake upgrade of any nature, and you have a car, again, that's not one of the later ABS cars, you should consider one of these no matter what you do. They're relatively inexpensive. We'll have a link to the product page down below in the description, so that way you can click on the current pricing for it, but they're cheaper than any brake kit, any set of pads, except for the dirty, nasty stuff you get from, you know, online shady dealers type of stuff. So really, there's not much of an excuse not to get one of these if you're upgrading your brakes. Strongly, strongly recommend it because it's easy and inexpensive. And you're getting to utilize power, braking power, that you can't tap with this unit. Another question was, does your suspension alignment need to be adjusted to compensate for brake bias? Maybe. In track instances, I could see that being a thing that you might want to change up your alignment a little bit, but we're getting off into the weeds. Normally, for most cars, what you're doing here, you're going to be affecting more of your stopping distances for applications that may already be set up and have a more sporty alignment dialed in on the car, or, you know, it'll be kind of, you're looking for the tenths of a second type of thing at the racetrack. So yes, but with lots of qualifiers on that one. It'll be one of the last things that you're looking to do, and probably if you're tracking the car, you should be experimenting with different alignment setups on your car anyway, until you find something that works for you, that you're getting even tire wear and good grip and all that kind of stuff, the right kind of handling characteristics. So without getting further off into the weeds, yes, but it's a tenths of a second type of thing that you're looking for, that you're hunting for at that point in time. Can you do, oh, this is a good one. Can you do 100% front brake bias and then use your front brakes and your handbrake for maximum stopping power? This question I have questions about, really. So my assumption is that you're thinking that if you were to not use your rear brakes at all and just control your rear brakes like hydraulically and just control your rear brakes with your handbrake, Could you do it? Yeah. Would you want to? Probably not. There are much better solutions for that, and realistically, if you want the most out of your brakes and you don't have to think with your foot and your hand while steering and, you know, looking where you're going, just get a prop valve. It's the easy way to go. If I'm totally misreading your question, call us, let us know. I'd love to talk to you more about this one, but short answer is I wouldn't make it that complicated if I didn't have to. Okay, and another question about the ABS. Somebody asked about how does electric brake distribution work and how does it affect what brakes and pads we should use? So this is for the ABS cars. Electric brake distribution is something that the ABS cars use, and basically in place of a proportioning valve, because they have smart computers in them that do all of the work for you. And they do have math and algorithms, and they're looking for different things like wheel slip and wheel speed to determine versus the other wheels if it should be applying the ABS and how much, that kind of stuff. And those systems are very complex. I don't have any numbers or examples for you because most of that stuff is pretty far over my head. But for those cars, the stock computer and the stock ABS system that have that setup, that have an automatic proportioning setup built into them, or the electric brake distribution setup, those cars are going to do it all for you. And they're going to be much smarter than most of us at applying the brakes when it needs to, where it needs to, and how much it needs to. And it's also going to be much faster than your average person at making those decisions and those changes. So, again, we've had a lot of rabbit holes that I've tried to bypass today, but without jumping down this one, just to kind of look down into the depths, your brake pad choices, your rotor choices, your stainless steel brake lines versus rubber hoses, all that kind of stuff, yes, it does affect how that works. But in most cases, unless you're making a drastic change, like much larger piston area on your new calipers or vastly different brake pad in the front versus the rear, something like that, your stock electronic smart system is probably going to be able to figure it out without too much trouble, and you're not even going to probably notice it from the driver's seat unless you're really tuned into your car. So if you're a race car driver, this is one of those things that you need to do test and tune to figure it out. If you're an average Joe driving on the street, it'll take care of you. No worries. Again, unless you're doing something way off in left field. So good questions, all of these. While I've been covering these, that was the last of the list that we had that I plan to talk about today. Do we have any new questions? What do we got?
We do.
I'll read them back to you too.
So the customer installed a 6-piston big brake kit, and they're wondering on initial prop valve adjustment, is there a place where you start?
Okay.
They are just about to the least bias, and the rears are locking up.
Interesting. Okay. So the question is basically for a new brake kit installation with aftermarket calipers, and getting this dialed in is where, or is there a good starting point to know roughly where to begin when you go out and do your testing in a parking lot or, you know, empty back road or something like that? And the short answer is no, because every setup's going to be a little bit different, and this will be something that you will need to go do repeated stops, you know, 10, 20, 30 times until you get it where it's supposed to be. The concern was that you have it set to where it's all the way counterclockwise for less brake, and that you're still getting an issue where your brakes are locking up in the rear before the fronts do. If that's the case, one, double check that you're looking at the knob and that you're thinking less brake versus more brake, because it is actually a little bit backwards from what you think, because less brake counterclockwise unscrews rather than screws down, because you'd think that as you tighten, you know, this, that it would restrict more, but it is actually backwards from that. So be careful, double check your adjustment knob for what you're doing and make sure that you're going the correct way, because it is easy to accidentally get mixed up. If it's not that, get a hold of us over the phone or via email, so that way we can help you out, because we probably will have a lot more questions about brake pads and other things going on, and we may need to do some troubleshooting with you to help you get it figured out. But The short answer is no. Start off with a conservative rear, set it mostly at less rear, and then start slowly dialing it up a turn, half a turn, something like that. Go out and do stops, jump out, do a little bit of a change until you get it to where your fronts are locking up after your rears, and then dial it back. Easy enough. If you've got questions beyond that, of course, let us know. Please get in touch with us. We'll see if we can get you sorted out. Any other questions about this?
Can you do your testing on dirt or gravel roads?
Can you do testing for dialing this in on dirt or gravel? Absolutely. So this is where if you are driving on different kinds of road conditions, it may be actually a good idea, or even if you're just having a set position that it's, this many turns different from asphalt, you will have a different setting for different kinds of road conditions in most cases, especially when we're talking about surfaces as slippery as gravel or asphalt. Gravel versus asphalt, or dirt versus asphalt. So you likely will want to change this for some of those lower friction surfaces. So yes, you would need to do different test and tune. If you did it first on asphalt and then went and did it on the dirt, you probably will want to adjust your bias to suit, because those slippery conditions may want you, or you may want to dial back the rear a little bit so that way the tail end isn't wagging on you as much. Sometimes it's hard to avoid. What else we got?
Any safety concerns with having too much rear bias?
Do we have any safety concerns with having too much rear bias? Absolutely. So that's just what I was talking about, that if you have too much rear bias, or basically your rear brakes are locking up before your front brakes, then the tail end of your car is going to be wagging, because basically you've lost traction at the back because your wheels and your brakes have stopped moving, even though the fronts are moving, and the car is going to want to spin around so that way the front is in the back and the back is in the front. So not usually a good scenario unless you're a pro drifter and you're out somewhere safe that's what you want to do. But most cases they're using throttle application, not brake application, to make that happen anyway. So yes, that's why we recommend open, empty parking lot, somewhere back road, away from people, away from things, because there is potential for this to go wrong if you're not paying attention and following the instructions. Good question. What else?
Should an ABS delete be done when removing the factory proportion?
Should an ABS delete be performed when installing one of these guys? If you want it to. So say you have a later NB with the ABS that does its own proportioning built in, or an NC, or even an ND, and you want to go to a non-ABS system, so that way you have complete control over your brake bias. Sure, because race car. If you want to do that, absolutely, you can. You'll likely be building brake lines, or at very least you'll be reappropriating brake lines and bending them a little bit, and making your own connections. So it's a little bit of a can of worms. We're not going to tell you how to do that, because, well, it's basically plumbing. It's possible, yes. A little bit of a left field kind of answer, so my apologies, but yes, you can do that if you want to. If it's a pure track car, you might want to. So it is possible, and if you get rid of that ABS, yeah, I'd say you'd want one of these guys, for sure. What else we got?
You mentioned it a little bit, but this is more direct. Does a four-wheel WilWood, the little big brake kit, change the bias in an ND?
So the question was, does one of our brake kits change the front to rear brake bias on any platform, really? And it can. In most cases, it does a slight amount. And that's why we recommend one of these guys with pretty much all of our NA and B kits. But with the later cars that have a smart ABS with proportioning built in, the difference between the stock and the aftermarket calipers is small enough that it can be absorbed by the factory's automatic brake system. So in those cases, you don't need to worry about it. If you're building your own brake system, you'll need to do some measurements and testing to make sure it's safe. But our systems are set up, we've done the research for you and have the right piston sizes and surface areas that you won't need to worry about that. They're not far enough off that your factory system can't handle the slight differences. Good questions. These are all great questions. Thank you, everybody.
Last great question.
We got any more? We got plenty more. Okay, let's do one more and we'll wrap it up because we're starting to get a little long in the tooth.
What kind of brake fluid is bright green?
What kind of brake fluid is bright green? So this is yeah, this is actually it's water with food coloring. Not recommended to be used in your car by any means. Water has a very low boiling point compared to brake fluid, so no, bad idea. No, it was just demonstrative purposes. Believe it or not, I had green food coloring water closer at hand than I had brake fluid for whatever odd reason today. So that's what I used for my test. All right, we'll stop there. If we didn't get to your questions, my apologies. We will answer them in the comments below. Thank you all very much for watching and for providing all of your questions and insights, and hopefully you learned something. Again, if you've got more questions beyond what we talked about today, feel free to reach out to us. We would love to be able to talk to you and help you out with your brake needs and questions. So, without further ado, thank you again. We very much appreciate it, and we will see you all next week, Thursday, 2 o'clock Mountain Time, for another episode of FM Live. Thank you all.